Welcome everybody to this week's edition. This is going to be a fun one as opposed to a halacha one. Hi Marcia, hi Ellie, we're just starting. So as the title said, this is going to be about three companies, Manischewitz, Maxwell House, and Coca-Cola, and the American story, the American Jewish story, how they through interactions with Jews or run by Jews, how they have had a huge impact on how we celebrate Pesach today. The first story is going to be about Manischewitz. It's the longest and potentially most interesting one. Manischewitz was not really a wine company when it started. It started as a Matzah company. And sometime in the 1940s, the Monarch Wine Company decided that they wanted to start making kosher wine, but they knew that nobody heard of Monarch wine, so they made a deal with Manischewitz. They said, we want to use your name, and Manischewitz was happy to get the publicity, so they leased the name, and that's how Manischewitz got into the wine business. But they actually started in the matzah business. So the story begins in the mid-1880s. A extremely respected Talmud Chacham named Rabbi Dov Ber Manischewitz immigrated from Prussia to Cincinnati, and he was a shochet. Back in those days, the shochet, the butcher, was often the second most respected person in town. The rabbi was like number one, and the shochet was number two, because he had to really know his stuff and had to be an ehrliche, honest Jew, because you're trusting your kashrus with meat with the shochet. Shochetim were in demand in America at the time, knowledgeable shochets. So people used to come to America to become a shochet, and it paid better in America than in the old country. So he came and he took a position as a shochet in Cincinnati, which had a pretty big Jewish population at the time. The Manischewitz family was, people have heard of the Salanter Rebbe as the founder of the Musar movement. Apparently he was a student of the Salanter Rebbe, and he was a great scholar. He was so highly regarded in terms of his honesty and religiosity. He became the personal shochet to the Salanter Rebbe. But then he came to America in 1886, and then in 1888, 2 years later, he decides to open a matzah factory. What prompted him to do that? That's an interesting background in itself. So most matzah in America back then, most matzah manufacturers were not very well known for being, the manufacturers were not well known for being religious. And people had some questions on the matzah. People wanted shmura matzah. So as a review, shmura matzah means it's watched by a Jew since the time it's cut in the field until it's made into matzah. In fact, the Rambam, we don't hold this way, but the Rambam says you're not even yotzi the mitzvah of matzah at the Seder unless you have shmura matzah. In America, most of the matzah manufacturers were not doing that. And even worse, potentially even worse, they were just buying flour from flour companies and making that into matzah. So what's the problem with that? So I can't tell you that what I'm about to tell you was true in the 1880s. I can tell you it's true now, why you cannot make matzah from regular flour. The wheat kernels are very rough on the machines that grind them. So what manufacturers do is they spray a mist on the wheat kernels to make them a little bit softer, and then they go through the grinding process. so that's a problem if you're trying to be sure that you don't have any chametz. So if you want to make your own matzah at home, you need to get special pesadika flour. That'd be the first thing you need to do. So that was a problem. And the Orthodox rabbis were not very happy with the state of matzah at the time in America. So Rabbi Dov Ber Manischewitz saw a good opportunity. He was well known as a very well-respected Orthodox Jew in the community, in his community, being a shochet from the old country. So he went into the matzah manufacturing business. Now, the interesting thing, the interesting thing is he used a machine as part of his manufacturing process. So that deserves a nice little digression / discussion. There's a lot of steps in making matzah. I guess those of you who have made challah, and I'm not one of them, you have to make the dough, you mix the ingredients, you need to knead it. And then also with matzah, you need to roll it out into flat pieces, poke holes in it which helps prevent it from rising, and then go into the oven. So a man named, in Europe in the 1830s, a man named Isaac Singer, who is not related to the Isaac Singer who also lived around the same time and invented the sewing machine, different person, different family. He invented a machine that would just do one part of that process, and that would be rolling out the dough. So in Europe, that engendered a fierce debate over whether that was permissible. The main objection is this: when a person makes matzah, he needs to do it l'shem mitzvah. He needs to do it intentionally for the purpose of fulfilling a mitzvah of eating matzah. So that means if you're not obligated in matzah, then the matzah that's made you can't use for the Passover Seder. So a person under the age of bar bas mitzvah can't make matzah. A non-Jew can't make matzah, or not kosher for Pesach. And according to Rav Shlomo Kluger, who was a very influential posek back then, he said if they can't make matzah, all the more so a machine can't make matzah. So in the around 1859, he wrote this 25-page pamphlet. It doesn't translate well into English. The title is something like a notification for Beis Yisrael. And he argued for 25 pages on why you can't use that kind of machine-made matzah for Pesach. And then he said, not only can't you use it for the Seder, but you can't use it for the rest of Pesach either, because people, if you allow matzah for Pesach, but then claim that very same matzah cannot be used for the Seder, people are going to get confused. So he said machine-made matzah cannot be used for Pesach. The main defense was a Rabbi Yosef Shaul Nathanson. Now, in researching this, one place said that it was Rav Shlomo Kluger's brother-in-law. I don't know if that's true or not. If so, that must have made for interesting family dynamics, because he published something called Bittul Hoda'ah, in other words, the nullification of the notification. And basically so this is going to be a quote, translated into English, a quote of two sentences from his teshuvah. He says, quote, "I don't know what he's thinking. Does he think machines make matzah through witchcraft?" Unquote. In other words, people make the dough and people do all the steps. It's just the rolling out part that they're not doing it. And he said it's really like a sophisticated rolling pin. It's just more efficient than that. So there's a big machlokes going on in Europe. And then as we talked about it, both in the last two sessions, we talked about halachic issues. There were meta-halachic issues going on. I'll just mention two of the two biggest ones. One is the whole question of modernity, right? The Reform movement was starting. People wanted to use organs during services. I mean, the whole thing, the whole issue of what new innovations are we going to allow in our traditional practices. So that was an issue. Another issue was a social justice issue. Matzah making is a very labor-intensive endeavor. And the idea was that you're going to put a lot of people out of work if you do this. On the other hand, it's going to make matzah a lot cheaper. So that issue cuts both ways. In any event, that is the original debate about machine matzah, but that debate never carried over into America. Why was that? The rabbis who came to America at that time were from the Polish, Litvish, Prussia area, which is where Rabbi Nathanson was from. So they tended to follow his rulings. Rabbi Shlomo Kluger was from the Galiciana area, and there weren't so many Jews from that area here. The other issue really was one of practicality. Again, another meta-halakhic issue. There was a huge growth of Jews in America, starting in the mid-1800s from Eastern Europe and Russia. And the rabbis, in the back of their mind at least, knew that if they objected to machine-made matzah completely, there would just not be enough matzah in America for Pesach. Obviously, each shul would have their own matzah bakes. So, you know, the Chabad matzah bakery thing that goes on every once in a while, that was a real thing back then. Each shul would do that, but there were becoming too many Jews to do that. Okay, fine. So Rav Dov Ber Manischewitz found his niche. With machine-made matzah, you can make it more efficiently. It was such a good idea that in the 1890s, he got a competitor. Simon Finkelstein was a competitor. Now, those who know the history of the conservative movement, there was a very esteemed, well-respected rabbi there in the early 1900s. His name was Louis Finkelstein. This happened to be Louis Finkelstein's father, Simon Finkelstein. Rabbi Manischewitz was a little bit stunned, and he didn't know what to do. So he wrote to his father in the old country and said, what do I do? I have a competitor now. So his father, perhaps under the influence of the Salanter Musar movement, said, you know, try to make peace, things will work out. And he didn't really offer any advice besides that. I mention that because it's an interesting PS to that part of the story, that Manishevitz's son ended up marrying Finkelstein's daughter, and the companies merged. So his father was right. His father was right. Make peace, it'll all work out. All right, so now, American capitalism in the 1890s. So what he needs Manischewitz needs a competitive edge. So there's three ways to make a competitive or so that he could sell at a lower price. The second way is to make a better matzah, one that was superior in quality. And the third way would be improving the image of the matzah. So people considered it superior to the competition. I guess that's like the basic ABCs of capitalism. Manischewitz managed to do all three. So first of all, besides being a Talmud Chacham and a smart businessman, either he or his research staff, somebody, they invented all kinds of machines to help automate the process. And eventually, you know, not such a long time afterwards, I don't know how long a time period it was, within a couple decades, the whole thing was completely automated. In fact, one of his advertisements is that this matzah is untouched by human hands. So I'll just take a little halachic digression. So if a machine, if it needs to be produced by somebody who is obligated in the mitzvahs, then how do you get around the fact that the whole thing, everything is automated? So the rule is that if a Jew like turns on the machine or starts the fire of a bakery, then that's enough. And that actually comes into other areas of halacha. So I won't go into that part. But the main thing is he automated the whole process. He had a whole bunch of patents on new machines. He was blowing away the competition. The next thing in quality control is every matzah looked like every other. And yes, Mike Sultan, he came up with the idea, why don't I make square matzahs? Because it's easier to go into the box and they'll all look the same. And he used that to his advantage. And even machine-made matzahs back then were round. He came up with the idea of making them square, which then everybody followed because he was the leader in making matzahs. The most interesting part of the story is the third leg of this, improving the image of his matzah. This is really fascinating. So for the secular Jewish media, he talked about, it's untouched by human hands, it tastes good, it's clean, it's healthy, it meets the highest standards. In the religious media and the Yiddish papers and stuff like that, his goal was to be able to say it's the most kosher matzah that there is, which actually is a big deal. I mean, the number one mitzvah on Pesach is the Seder, and the number one mitzvah at the Seder is to eat matzah and tell the story, right? So you want your matzah at the Seder to have the highest level of standards. And of course, remember, there were no companies that offered Hechsherim at that time. So, all right, this is great. So in the 1930s, he sends his two sons to Israel to learn, and they were each there for like 10 years or something. And this was before it was such a thing to, go off to Israel to learn. They didn't have gap years back then. And both the sons married into prominent families, and they used this as advantage. So there are ads in the 1930s or 40s where they boast of having of rabbis certifying or certifying that their products were kosher from, I don't know if you know many of these names, but Rav Hildesheimer was the biggest, most important rabbi in Berlin. In fact, he's the one who gave smicha to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Rav Meir Shapiro backed it. He's the one who started Daf Yomi and the head of the Lubliner yeshiva. Rav Kook, the famous Rav Kook in Israel, backed it. He had 70 rabbis that all backed it. There were even European Hasidic groups that insisted on getting Manischewitz matzah imported from America. That you should use that for Pesach, which is, how in the world did that happen? So I said the years wrong. So he sent his sons to Israel in around the 1910s. In 1919, he founded a yeshiva in Israel, or the sons founded a yeshiva called Yeshivat Manischewitz. And this was way before yeshiva. And it's even like, to name it after somebody's last name is even more odd. They could have named it Yeshivas Rabbeinu Dovber, which is, Yeshiva University is named, the rabbinical school is named after Yitzhak Elkanan, whatever. They didn't use his last name, right? Yeshiva Chavetz Chaim. But this is before any of those things happened. And then later, he took one of the important rabbis that was teaching at that yeshiva, and he brought him to America to supervise this is Rabbi Hochstein. He brought him to America to supervise the matzah baking going on there. And Rabbi Hochstein knew all the rabbis, knew all the important rabbis of the world. He knew all the important rabbis for sure in Israel, and also he knew the ones in Europe. So through those personal connections, he was able to get the endorsement of like almost every famous rabbi in the whole world at the time. So how do we know that part? So this is really interesting. In 1948, the Irs Investigated Manischewitz, because Manischewitz had wrote off their contributions to the yeshiva as a business expense. The yeshivas in Israel at that time they weren't 501c3 organizations. They couldn't take them as a charity deduction. So they wrote off as a business expense. So how did they justify it as a business expense? It looked like a donation. So it's all black and white. You can go on the web, IRS versus, or Manischewitz versus Commissioner of the IRS. If you Google it, you'll find it pretty easily. You can see the whole case there. And they explained to the court that the reason for this yeshiva was to get known in the Orthodox world here to have the highest level of kashrus. So that's how Manischewitz, that's the longest and most involved story I have. I want to talk quickly about Maxwell House. We all know about the Maxwell House Haggadah. My most recent understanding is, it's probably out of date, the 55 million Maxwell House Haggadahs have been printed, and it is the most widely, still to this day, most widely used Haggadah in the world. So how did that come to be? That actually also came to be because of a halachic machlokas. Ashkenazim do not eat kitnios on Pesach. What are kitnios? So many people say, well, beans and other grains are kitnios. Beans, coffee beans. So a number of rabbis in the 1700s said that coffee beans are kitnios, so you can't have coffee on Pesach. The Chida, who was a tremendous Talmud Chacham and wrote various things. I thought he wrote mostly on Hasidic stuff. Maybe he writes on halachic stuff, whatever. He was also a big traveler. He traveled around the world. He was born in Israel, but traveled all around Europe and Northern Africa. And he saw a coffee plant, and he said, these aren't beans. The coffee plant is really halachically a tree. And if you were to eat a coffee bean, well, people don't eat coffee beans, but if people did eat coffee beans, you'd have to say Brei Priya Eitz on them. So, so he said, of course not. Of course Ashkenazim can have them. But it was a long time custom among Jews not to drink coffee still, even though he made this ruling in the 1700s. Even as late as the 1900s, Jews were very hesitant about drinking coffee on Pesach. In 1923, a man named Joseph Jacobs, who was an advertiser or worked in advertising for the Yiddish Forward, the publication, the Yiddish Forward, decided to open up his own advertising agency. And I will mention, if you want to go on the internet, he still has it. Well, it was 100 years ago. It's not him, but there's still the Joseph Jacobs Advertising Agency, which is an advertising agency that is specifically towards Jews. So this is the kind of thing he does. So he walked into the Maxwell House offices and said, "Give me an account. Let me advertise your coffee to Jews, and I'll, in the advertising, I'll explain that it's kosher for Pesach." And they said, yeah, they did. Joseph Jacobs said, I'll get an Orthodox rabbi to supervise your plant, and it'll be great. So that's what he did. And he went so far as to claim it's the only coffee permitted on Pesach, because it was the only coffee brand that had a rabbi supervising it. Maxwell House was, I don't know what it is today, but then it was by far the largest coffee company in existence. And then finally, the rest of the story, which we could probably all guess, in 1932, Joseph Jacobs had this brilliant idea. And those of us who grew up in the 60s, remember if you buy X amount, like you get a free volume of Golden Book Encyclopedia or whatever, right? So he used that idea, or I don't know if he came up with the idea, this incentivized purchase. If you buy a can of Maxwell House coffee, you get a Haggadah with it. And Maxwell House saw a lot of increased sales, and the rest is history as far as that goes. That's how Maxwell House became so ubiquitous. I should say that Joseph Jacobs, as I mentioned, they still do all the marketing towards the Jewish media. So back in the I want to say sometime 1990s, Oreos removed lard from their recipe and they're baking cookies. So it was the Joseph Jacobs advertising agency that then walked in and got the account and said, "Let me advertise to the Jewish world that Oreos are now kosher." They're OUD. They're not Chalav Yisrael, but they're OUD. And the third story. This is going to go over by about 10 minutes. I'm going to end at 1:40 rather than 1:30. I apologize. The third story is the Coca-Cola story. The Coca-Cola story really is not as interesting as the rabbi who arranged all this. Coca-Cola was invented around 1885. It had claims, medical claims to it, and it actually had some cocaine in it, which was removed by 1903 or so. The story really is about Rabbi Tuvia or Tobias Geffen. He was born in Lithuania. He was a huge Talmud Chacham. He studied in Slobodka. I mean, he was the real deal, a real Torah scholar. He came after the Kishinev pogrom. He decided where they lived was not safe anymore for Jews, so they emigrated to America. He came to the Lower East Side. At first, he couldn't get a job. He actually worked in a sweatshop. And then he became a fundraiser for a Jewish organization, and where he traveled all over the eastern United States. In Canton, Ohio, he was so impressed by them that right on the spot, they hired him as a rabbi in Canton, Ohio. He must have been a special man because of the things I'm about to tell you, including this one. There was a machlokas between two Orthodox synagogues in Canton. There were only two, and they were at odds with each other, and they were rivals. And not only did he make peace between them, but he ended up being the rabbi of both congregations. Unbelievable. In any event, he couldn't take the winters so much, so he looked for another position 5 or 10 years later. He ended up going to Atlanta, where he stayed for 60 years. He died just short of the age of 100. So he was in Atlanta in a big congregation there. And he was such a Talmud Chacham, one of the few that was in America at that time. We're talking like by the 1910s, there were not very many Talmud Chachams that were here. So people all over America would send him all kinds of questions, and he would answer them. In the late 1920s, early 1930s, he started getting questions, is Coca-Cola kosher? And partly they were asking him is because a very influential rabbi named Rabbi Pardes, who started the HaPardes Journal, said that it was kosher. And I think Rabbi Pardes actually at one point said he visited some plants, everything looked kosher, so it's okay. So other rabbis weren't so sure, and they figured this Rabbi Geffen is such a Talmud Chacham, and he lives in Atlanta, where Coca-Cola is headquartered. So he started asking him. They started asking him the question: is Coca-Cola kosher? So he did some investigation, and he was skeptical, and he actually wrote back. He apparently wrote to Rabbi Pardes and said, "I'm not so sure it's kosher." Rabbi Pardes wrote back to him and said, well, you know what? Everybody, a lot of rabbis think it is, and everybody in America drinks it. So the burden is on you to show that it's not kosher. That is not how we look at things in today's day and age. Again, remember, still in the 1930s, there were no hechshering organizations. So according to family lore, I don't know how much Rabbi Geffen had a daughter named Helen who went to public school. There were no day schools. In fact, I think later on, later on, he actually started a day school. I got a message saying that my internet connection is not stable. So raise your hands if you need me to repeat stuff. Later on, he started his own he started a day school down there. But his daughter went to public school. According to family lore, she graduated first in her class, gave the valedictory speech, and a man named Harold Hirsch, happened to be there and was so impressed with it, with her, he decided he would pay for her to go to college. Harold Hirsch happened to be the vice president and general counsel of the Coca-Cola Company. He was a brilliant lawyer. He was active in the Reformed Jewish congregations in Atlanta at that time. So Rabbi Geffen got to know Rabbi Hirsch, Harold Hirsch. So he approached him. He used his personal connections. He approached him. He said, look, is there any way I can find out what the ingredients are to Coca-Cola? Because people want to know it's kosher. So Harold Hirsch at first said, no, you can't get the ingredients list. What are you, nuts? And Rabbi Geffen said, I'm going to have to tell people. So Harold Hirsch said, let me work on it. Apparently it took like 6 months. And they actually told, the Coca-Cola Company told Rabbi Geffen that they could see his ingredients list. So he saw the ingredients list. He saw that a number of ingredients were made by Procter & Gamble, which is in Cincinnati. So he went to the Procter & Gamble factory in Cincinnati, and he found two problems. One was that the glycerin that was being sent to the Coca-Cola bottle company in Atlanta, the glycerin, I don't fully understand what glycerin is, but it can be made animal or plant, and they were using animal glycerin. That was making it not kosher. And he also found that there was a grain-based sweetener that was being used. This was not corn syrup, but something else. I'm not exactly sure what it was. A grain-based sweetener, which then caused a secondary problem if you wanted to drink Coke on Pesach. So now remember, if you think about it, this is sort of a rare thing. So the problem here, or the initiative here, was that this Rabbi Pardes wrote to Rabbi Geffen and said, the burden is on you to prove it's kosher. So Rabbi Geffen found out, you know what, it's not kosher. And it could have ended right there. But he knew that Jews across America were drinking Coca-Cola. So he took the initiative totally on his own. He took the initiative and he approached the Coca-Cola Company, and he basically asked them to change their formula just for Jews. Jews were not, Jews were growing compared to the Jewish population, but in terms of the American population, Coca-Cola could have easily blown them off. But apparently he was such a mensch, and he was so polite. This is a guy, I mean, if you look on the internet, if you look for pictures of him, he looks really old school. Big hat. Apparently, Yiddish was his first language. English was like his third language. He wasn't that great in English. And yet everybody could see that he was such a mensch and so honest, and he was not doing this for money. Between his personality and the in he had through this man, Harold Hirsch, the Coca-Cola Company actually changed their formula. They decided to go with plant glycerin instead of animal glycerin. And they even took the additional step of changing their formula just for Pesach, that they would do a special Pesach run. And Rabbi Geffen finally wrote his teshuvah and explained more or less the whole process. He said, there was a problem with some ingredients, but I found a way around it. And I talked Coca-Cola into changing their manufacturing.
Dad, you're cutting out.
Can't hear you.
By which he could, unstable?
Yeah, we lost you
Unstable.
for like 4 sentences maybe.
Okay. Thank you. My last couple sentences are that I want to read a quote summarizing this aspect of this episode in Rabbi Geffen's life from an article that was part of this year. Quote, Rabbi Geffen's attempt to find a means by which he could satisfy the regulations of Jewish law while not challenging common practice reflects an attitude that was critical to the development of Orthodoxy in America in the first half of the 20th century. He was sufficiently astute enough to recognize that by declaring Coca-Cola non-kosher, even though he was perfectly halachically correct, it would have been ignored by most of the Jewish community. So he went and found a way to make it kosher for everybody. So all kudos to him. That ends my story. I love these 3 stories because they tell the story of Jews in America. Manischewitz story is about a Jew stepping in and filling a need for the growing Jewish population, which required inventing new machines to make matzahs at such a high rate. And it's the story of Jewish freedom in America to self-actualize themselves and to jump into the capitalist world of America and make a success both for himself and to the benefit of all the Jews in the country. The Maxwell House is a similar story. It's about a Jewish agency that approaches the biggest coffee company in the world at the time. And can you imagine that happening in the shtetls in Europe? You know, some old world Jew just walking in and say, "Have I got an idea for you?" They would have thrown him out. And for Maxwell House to think it was worth their money to advertise to the Jewish population and to print all these Haggadahs for 51 weeks a year, and they made all these changes just to enable Jews to enjoy coffee for 1 week out of the year. And finally, Coca-Cola, where you have this old world scholarly rabbi who doesn't speak English that well, but through his menschlichkeit and connections is able to convince the largest soft drink company in the world to change their ingredients and to change them a second time and do a special run just for Pesach. To this day, we look for the yellow caps on the Coca-Cola bottles. So the story of Jews in America and how these companies have affected our Pesach. So thank you for coming this afternoon. That was a fun one for me. I'm not sure what we're going to do next week, but feel free to send me suggestions. The recording now.